Hello and welcome to our presentation, How to Conduct an Effective Committee Meeting. And I hope that you find these tips that will give you and processes make your committees more welcoming, more appreciated and even a bit of fun occasionally, maybe. Okay, we're presenting this really with the help of the Council, Port Adelaide Enfield, and we appreciate the opportunity to be able to present it to you. I'm Hans van Bevel. I'm your presenter for this particular presentation, and I'll just give you a little bit of background about myself. I have a background in management development, but for the last 12 years I've been focusing particularly on sports management development and issues around governance, operating procedures and so on. That's been partly through work with the Office for Recreation, Sport and Racing in the Star Club program, which has been one that you may be well familiar with. I've also been a mentor for many clubs in that situation and guided them, and they've also taught me a few things about running an organisation like a sports club or a community club. I've been a sports administrator for many years myself, including on state boards and also in my own club as secretary, and that really is a practical edge, if you like, that I feel that I present to you tonight, because we want things to be effective and as easy as possible and, as I said, as enjoyable as possible too. So we have some formal aims. It's always the necessity to do that, I feel. We've got a recommended process for conducting a regular committee meeting. That's obviously the main reason why we're doing this presentation. But we've got some tips for you for effective management of a meeting that you may not have come across before. Next, an outline of managing time, action items, and decision making as well. And some of those things can often cause stress in committees, so we hope that it will make it a little bit easier for you once you've seen this information. We've also got suggestions for the next step, including resources that might make it all come together for you. You may also be running these committee meetings that you have now reasonably well, so it's also a case of knowing what you're doing well as anything you might want to improve. I've got a few cartoons in this presentation. I think they're a bit of fun, but they also give sometimes a really good message. Instead of risking anything new, let's play it safe by continuing our slow decline to obsolescence. Now, there are, believe it or not, quite a few clubs in clubland that actually operate like that, because it is comfortable, it's safe, maybe there's lack of skill or knowledge or understanding. Whatever it is, it's very, very easy for a club to have that decline to obsolescence without really looking at your own opportunity to learn and do things that little bit better. So we'll give you some constructive recommendations, as I said. I sort of look at committees and their meetings with two aspects in mind, and I'll be covering both to a degree. I think you really need to have a positive mindset, and the very first thing is I think you need to think of your committee as a team. Ironically, committees normally have teams that they're responsible for in their membership, and that don't always run like a team. So I think it's important to think of it that way. And then, of course, a team has responsibilities, and it's important that running a meeting is actually an opportunity to actually make sure that your responsibility is to be a constructive team using processes that are effective really can make a difference to a club's success. As part of that mindset, I'll give you some tips around that already. I'll call it balancing the three positions. And that's the way we suggest you think about your involvement with the club in almost everything you do. So it's an overarching perspective that I'm giving you. The first position is the one that we're all really comfortable with, and that's where we come from as individuals. We've got our experience, we've got our passions, we've got our knowledge, and it often comes from the heart, which is why I've got that symbol there. However, we shouldn't be on a committee running a meeting and only thinking of that particular aspect, because it's a pretty self-centred one. The next one is being in the second position. I've got the little shoes on the other side there to indicate it's about really putting yourself in someone else's shoes. Your stakeholders, who include members, maybe your sponsors, maybe the people who are going to give you or not give you a grant. It could be all of those and more. And so putting yourself in their shoes when you're actually running a meeting in particular is something that I think you need to think about. It's kind of being like customer-centred, as it were, because you are, after all, acting on behalf of other people when you're on a committee. The third position is taking a big picture or strategic view of things. You're in a pretty privileged position because you normally have access to really important information that may be 1 or 2 or even 3 years hence. Trends in sport, new innovations that your national state organisation is contemplating, and so on. So you have that obligation to think big picture too. And so if you combine the three and get those in some sort of balance, the chances are your meetings will be fruitful and will be really meaningful to everybody in your organisation and club. So let's go to the meeting itself now. The very first thing is actually before the meeting even happens. And the idea there is that I think these days it's a good idea to use email activity as much as is practically possible because it saves a lot of rambling, as it were, within a committee meeting itself. So normally you would do that via the secretary. Okay. So when do you do it? Okay, for quick decisions and matters that can't wait. So if something's urgent, you can send it to the secretary. They can in turn perhaps discuss it with the president and then discuss what has to be done. Secondly, for non-critical matters, that actually avoids the unnecessary discussion at meetings. So if it's a simple thing about, do we start at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock with our training schedule or something like that, why not do that between meetings? How? Obviously advise the secretary, who circulates the topic generally among all the members of the committee. You may decide that you can do that immediately without going only to the secretary, so you can do it through the whole committee at once. Stating what's required from the committee as well. So committee feedback plus the result and the related action is noted on upcoming meeting minutes. So it's a good chance to actually make some decisions, get ready for some actions before and between meetings. And I really strongly suggest that that's the way to go, where possible. So how do you contribute agenda items to the secretary? I think there's a very good little simple way of doing this that actually helps your case if you particularly want some innovation to happen. So, for example, do it in writing, fairly obviously, so no verbal between the scenes here so that nobody else knows what's going on. So in writing, so it's all transparent, and I suggest again the what, why, how approach is a great way to do this. Explain what the issue is and why it needs attention. And the why is really important because that's the nut of the reasoning behind why you want something to happen. And if people know that, it opens up their understanding of your perspective. The action required, which is really the how. So you might want to suggest, you may not have the answer, but you might want to suggest a couple of ways that you could go forward with this particular innovation or suggestion or issue. So it could be just to approve something, so they just have to say, yeah, go ahead, or to review something, or just you might want creative ideas, and they might be brought to the meeting itself. I also suggest it can be useful to prioritise. It may be obvious in what your issue is, but I would suggest that prioritising in some way, and often a 1, 2, 3 principle works really well. So the 1 is highly important or must do. 2 is, look, really should be done because I think it's going to make a difference. Or 3, look, if we don't get time to do it at this meeting, we might want to just leave it, but I think we need to cover it at some stage, something like that. Just gives people a sense of, when we're at the meeting as well, how important it is to actually make sure that not only is it on the agenda, but how long it will take. It's also not for the secretary to decide what goes on the agenda. They have to actually agree to actually putting an item that you think is important on the agenda. Check also if it's related to the strategic plan. Assuming you've got one, I hope you do, or at least the objectives of the club, and that would normally be in your constitution because it gives everybody an idea that you're actually doing something that relates to the longer term benefit of the club as well and is related to what's important to the club as well. Finally, send the items to the secretary with any associated pre-readings. So there may be an article, a document, or even a letter of some sort. And I think, again, being transparent and open is really, really helpful. So when you actually get to the meeting, club members and committee members in particular have a really good idea of what this is all about, and there's no real surprises. It also means that the hard part of your work is done. In other words, you've created a case for whatever it is you want done. Now, here's an interesting little cartoon. I'm sure you can relate to it in some way. Most people can. Okay, you see that there's a nice little committee there. They happen to be sitting on top of a very large elephant. Okay, they're saying, okay, team, that's everything on the agenda. Any other business or anything we've missed? And the elephant in the room is ignored. So the idea of this presentation is to help you avoid the elephants in the room at all, if possible, and hopefully if you've got elephants in the room, ways to actually make the elephant go as small as a small dog, hopefully. So the idea is all about creating a culture that is willing to actually deal with things in an impersonal and organised way. So, some constructive behaviours for committee members. And this is where you get into the issue of the balance between being a team as opposed to just doing the responsibility bit. You need to comply with the agreed process of the meeting. So it's sometimes very easy for people to subvert the meeting process, and it does take a strong chair to actually make sure that doesn't happen. But you need to cooperate and make that job easier for the chairperson. I suggest this is where you already start rethinking about the three positions that I mentioned earlier. Balance between the first position, yourself, the second position, having empathy for other people and putting yourself in their shoes, and the third position, what's good for the overall club. And it may even be the community, it may be wider than your club. Respect the role of chairperson. And that person has been authorised, after all, by the committee to actually run the meeting. Doesn't mean they own the meeting, but they actually have to make sure it's managed. And you need to be cooperative in that role. Encourage transparency, which I've already mentioned. Actively listen. And actively listen doesn't just mean you hear and you maybe waft off into some other topic in your own mind, but actually means to really take note. And one great way of telling whether you're actively listening is maybe even asking a question or two around what people are saying and say, well, from what I'm hearing, is this what you're saying? It's quite a skill to be prepared to do that. It doesn't mean you do all the talking, it rather means you do all the questioning. And to be patient as well, hear people out. It's another thing that's really important, and leave it up to the chair to decide whether the discussion is going on too long. Avoid making personal attacks. This is not the place for it. If there's an issue with one person or another lot of people, unless it's a real discriminatory issue, then it should be done outside the committee meeting itself. Offer constructive ideas that follow the what, why and how principle at all times. And that's why if you have all the agendas written out that way, no matter how brief, it actually gives a process which is impersonal. Show appreciation for others' ideas. You might even disagree with it, but you say, look, thanks for bringing that up, and this is what I think. You can maybe give your case. And finally, adhere to the code of conduct. So overall, the code of conduct is not just for people on the field or the playing field, but rather it actually applies to you on the committee just as much. Now, this is a reflection opportunity. So, think about and prioritise what I've covered so far, and think, what do we need to make good in our particular process so far? I haven't covered all of it, of course, but it gives you a chance to think about maybe even the elephants in the room and how you might deal with that. And now to the meeting itself. And I guess the agenda of a meeting dictates how the meeting will progress from start to finish, so that's what I'm going to cover. Many of you may be familiar with this process, and there's not only one way of doing this, but this is a way that I feel works really well, and from feedback I receive, it does seem to make the meetings tighter. I've been to both clubs and associations where they have 4-hour meetings. I suggest that's too long because their process is not tight like this. So I think it needs to have some discipline, but it generally works well. First thing, obviously, welcome to everybody, and also have an attendance check because there needs to be a written record of actually who's at a particular meeting. That's really quite an important sort of legal requirement, as well as the apologies, in other words, people who can't be there. So that's got to be noted. Then minutes of the previous meeting should be checked, moved and accepted or amended where necessary. I always recommend that the Secretary should send out the minutes to the committee before the meeting so that people are re-familiarising themselves with the content, and so that it makes sure that nothing is missed when they're being rechecked at the meeting itself, and it saves a bit of time generally as well. Correspondence is then dealt with both in and out, and that's any material that may have been necessary to discuss or to deal with from the Secretary's point of view between meetings, and also, of course, those emails that I talked to you about a little bit earlier. And any email activity that happened, it's a chance to say, well, this email came in from committee member X, this is what happened. You can get verification if the Secretary at least hasn't got a reply yet, and also actions noted in terms of who did what and when, or if it isn't done, who needs to do what and when. And if it's fairly complex, it may go into, in fact, new business. So it just needs to be noted, though, at that point, because it was part of the correspondence that occurred. The Treasurer's report, I think, is very important to make sure that your Treasurer actually gives you an update on the financial matters of the club, because it's responsibility of all committee to be aware of what's going on financially in the club as much as any other aspect of the club's activities. And they can be moved or accepted, and any amendments required may be noted as well. It's also a chance to see whether there's actually something coming up that the Treasurer may be able to alert you to that you need to be aware of in the future. The next thing that happens is business arising. And that's where you need to discuss and action anything that you feel is important. It could include some of those issues that were sent to the Secretary in between the meetings, or it could be something that has been alerted to a particular committee member that needs to be expressed in some way and discussed and dealt with. That should lead us to new business, which is obviously a critical part of any meeting. And this is where I think a process needs to be relatively disciplined without stifling creative discussion and solutions if it's appropriate. Okay, I've got an example there. Agenda item number 1, maybe there's 8 agenda items or 4 agenda items, whatever. So obviously the idea of numbering makes it a little bit easier. And I think underneath that you should have what I call a planning pillar listed. If you've got a strategic plan, the chances are that you've got strategic directions. There are various terms you can use for it, or key operating objectives, whatever, for a strategic plan is normally around about half a dozen. It may vary, of course, in different clubs, but you should have them. This one in particular is marketing and promotion. So that's the particular pillar that this particular agenda item is going to roughly deal with. Underneath that, outline what it is. It's a fairly simple one here. In this case, it's on a board's update. So someone has obviously gone to put a case for updating the honour boards in this particular club. Approximate time proposed, I think, speaks for itself. And then the discussion required and agreed action points that need to come out of it. So if all those things are actually written down there, I think it's really easy to follow for everybody on the committee. Now, the meeting minutes generally will follow the club's discussion at the meeting itself. So the meeting should reflect and mirror really what's going on in the meeting. And of course the Secretary, or at least somebody there, normally it would be a Secretary, would actually be recording the information that goes on at the meeting itself. So the write-up should mirror as well, as I said, the process that was used. So I've used another club example there. This case, point 7 was new business in this particular meeting agenda. Club planning pillar in this case wasn't marketing and promotion, it was actually social and club culture. 7.1, post-state relays celebration. As with last year, the current plan for a celebration after state relays is to head to Belize after the competition. Now, it's very informal in this case because it's a fairly simple suggestion, and the result is self-explanatory, but it still follows that what, why, how, really. So what we're going to do is to celebrate. Why we're going to do it is because we want to celebrate and enjoy the occasion after the event, and how is to go to Belize. The action point is really important here. Every action needs to be after every discussion point, and that's often forgotten. So the people who are responsible for it might know, but why not be transparent so everybody's clear, and afterwards when the minutes are sent out, the person responsible knows they've got to do it. In this case, it's P, let's just say Peter, is to publicise on Facebook by the 30th of March. That's their deadline, that's their requirement. Now, I haven't got room here, but there may be 2 or 3 or 4 action points. Another action point might be Jane to actually organise booking the venue and booking the table and checking menus and so on. Okay, I hope that is sort of clear how that would look. And that should, as I said, mirror the actual agenda item as it was discussed in the meeting itself. So we need to talk about the role of the chair. As I said, that person is often in charge of managing the whole thing. However, if you look at this particular cartoon, I would not recommend this approach. I called the meeting today to discuss a decision I've already made. Now, the idea here is that you will often get chairs who suddenly get a huge welling up of power, and they tend to run everything that goes on in the meeting. Now, that's not the role of a chair. I don't want to be just negatively critical, but the issue is that that person does sometimes have an ego that's really a chance to explore with their role, but also sometimes it's simply because that person has always been the go-to person and they've actually accumulated that expertise or whatever, and so they become totally being relied upon as being the one who actually runs the whole show. A committee is a team, remember that, and you have a responsibility to make sure that's the way it operates. So, what are the responsibilities? Okay, leads by management in terms of managing the process and the flow. The chair does not have to be the president. Most people don't realise that. Certainly, in my club experience, for I think about 8 years, we had a president who actually delegated the role of chair to somebody who was much more comfortable with actually managing people. But that person had their own skills, and that worked really well as a kind of partnership. So as long as that's really understood, it should work really well. Considers discussion length according to priorities. That's where if you put your priorities in when you put your agenda items out, it gives you a very, very good opportunity to sort of give a rough idea of how long something should take to talk about. Encourages a spirit of collaboration and consensus. So this is where, I guess, group skilling can be really useful. Looking for body language, for example, and saying, okay, if somebody there is generally very quiet, just ask them maybe, what do you think, Jill, or something like that. Or somebody who's doing a lot of talking, maybe say, okay, look, thanks for your discussion, but that's enough, we need to go on now. Be prepared to say that. Excuse me. Reminds members to keep to the agenda topic being discussed. It's really easy to go off on a tangent. Oh, gee, wasn't that win last week fantastic? And then go on for 5 minutes, where in fact you're not supposed to be dealing with that at that point in time. Summarises longer and complex discussion. That's again often forgotten. So the idea is that if you do a little bit of a summary, just make sure that everybody actually understands what the point is, or what the solution is, or what the action is. And you can use the secretary to repeat back sometimes some of the recording. Ensure adherence to agreed voting strategies when decisions are made. Quite often, depending on what's in your constitution, it might be just putting the hands up and majority rules. And works closely with the minutes taker or secretary, usually, to verify accuracy of information. That can be either during the meeting or afterwards. So, this is an interesting little committee, isn't it? So the chair is saying, so that's our new strategy. Does everyone understand? Just look at what they say. I'm hungry. Nice tie. Are we done yet? Should I buy a boat? And I guess they're not engaged, are they? So that's why it's important to actually keep your committee engaged. So next I want to cover the role of committee members. And I mentioned about the team issue. The role of the chair is one thing, but it also needs cooperation from the team members as well on the committee. So when you're discussing agenda items, keep to an agreed time limit unless negotiated, so you are a little bit disciplined that way. However, it doesn't mean that you can't be a little bit flexible. If something's really important and it goes on for another 5 minutes, you can quickly negotiate that with the chair and the other committee members. Remember the 3 positions approach to presenting information. Balance between your thoughts, what you think your members might be thinking, or what's good for the organisation as a whole, or even the whole sport, could be relevant. Be constructive and impersonal. So talk about the data, the facts, the information, not about other people and what you think of them. Listen and look for cues of understanding. That's really important. When you're presenting something, then you might want to say, okay, are people in fact thinking about whether they're going to buy a boat, or are they actually thinking about what it is that you're talking about? And you can usually see that by the attentiveness of your members, and you can actually say, look, I really need you to think about this because it's important, or whatever. Seek and welcome constructive feedback. Some people are really scared of feedback, but feedback is the way you know whether you're being supported or not, and so there's no surprises. And after all, if the idea is not worthy of going forward, then it's not worthy. So that's the way you have to think about it. If people think your idea is good and you've done your what, why and how properly, it gives people a good chance to make an objective decision. Ask yourself, in general discussion, are you adding to the discussion? So sometimes silence is golden, and it really means a lot to hold back and make sure that everybody else has their say. Keep to factual data. I'm a great believer in something called directly observable data. So rather than going on opinion or hearsay or whatever, what are the facts? Have you got the information? We all know with social media now, it's much easier to get hearsay and things third hand than actual factual information. So try and keep on the straight and narrow that way. And finally, suppress your ego. You don't want to outdo the chair, or you don't want to necessarily hog the whole discussion. It's about, again, silence is golden rule. Sometimes it's better to say nothing, and you're probably going to get more respect from your fellow committee members. So here's a reflection opportunity again. Consider the information that I've told you about, particularly the actual meeting process technique. Consider the points you think need attention, and to tailor your meeting approach and maximise its effectiveness. You can tailor to your own needs, as I said, but I think you'll find if you follow these particular steps, it'll be a very organised meeting. Making decisions is pretty critical. Decisions normally, first of all, require a forum. So there's no point deciding something if you haven't got a quorum. Normally, it depends on what's in your constitution. Normally, it's 1/2 in terms of committee members, but it could be different. You need to check that. Any validation for anything to be done normally requires a vote. Normally, a show of hands. Fairly simple. If the majority can't agree, then rather than having debates about it, basically say, sorry, we don't agree, therefore we need to leave it. You might have to come back with a better case, or you might just have to drop it, and be prepared to drop it. Now, something called motions, which you're probably familiar with, are really only required if there's something that requires a reasonably major change or a policy change. So if there's a change in terms of the numbers of teams you're going to have in your competition next season, for example, that would quite obviously be a policy change, and that would need to be put in the form of a motion. Changes to the Constitution require a general special meeting or an AGM, so that's a different thing altogether. Generally, your policies are things that you can change at the meetings, as I've indicated. I will cover motions briefly because it's a fairly simple process if you follow the approach. A motion is a formal proposal for action put to a meeting, which is why it's normally only kept for things that are relatively important, and they need to have the support of the committee to enact the change. The chairperson should call for the mover of the motion to summarise in favour. This is a chance to review the case for change. Again, you can use your what, why and how. And then the chairperson can call for anyone who wants to speak against the motion. And you can also use the what, why and how rebuttal, if you like. Then there needs to be a vote on what you think in terms of as a committee, which normally is called a resolution. If the resolution has been passed, we normally say on the minutes it's carried by a majority or it can be carried unanimously, and that's the end of the matter, and the action then gets taken up. If amendments required, and sometimes wording of a motion, which is normally formal wording, it's an official statement if you like, needs to have some tweaking, then if it's unsuccessful, then you can go through the process of why people don't agree to the amendment. And sometimes amendments can be quite significant, so you need to be prepared to go through that process again. Okay, it's a chance to reflect again in this session. So consider your decision-making approach. How fair are you? What chance do you give to actually get things done? And check your constitution too and decide if that needs to be amended in some way depending on the issue. Now, briefly, this is what I think is probably one of the key tips that I'm going to give you, and that is all about doing that what, why, how in a development plan. So let's just say an action has been agreed, maybe a motion was carried, maybe you're going to change your club logo. What we want to work on and achieve, update the logo. Why it needs to be done? There's recently a case of the logo was seen to be racially discriminatory, and it followed a sport that uses a lot of what I call Americanisms, and they decided that it needs to be changed because, and you need to have your little case for change because it will affect the whole club's image, if you like. How your task will be achieved, key steps, agree on the timelines, who is responsible, and the reporting process. Who's responsible may not be the person who's actually doing it, but it needs to be the person who has ownership of it and needs to make sure it gets done, no matter how they delegate. So, I mentioned the word delegate there, considering the skills of your committee, but also potentially volunteers outside the committee as well. Now, I mentioned early on that there's ways in which you can get more information, if you like. Templates are really useful because they give another perspective and maybe an easy checkpoint approach to the way you run your meetings, other than what I've presented to you in this presentation. We've got an organisation called Club Help, Sport Australia as well, and Sports Community with associated websites, and very easy to access, and you'll find anything you need regarding running a meeting in those particular organisations' material. Secondly, contact your parent organisation or other sports clubs and just see what's available out there. There are plenty of sports clubs around who have achieved a meeting that they appreciate in terms of the approach, and I think it's well worthwhile just checking it out, what they do, and you can probably learn from each other. Again, you may be running these meetings well, but on the other hand, I'm sure that you think there are some ways they can improve as well, and that's what we're offering you. So it just leaves for me to say all the very best with the future, and I hope that this presentation has been very worthwhile for you and that your meetings become a more pleasant exercise. Thank you.